a legal expert, Elton Hart, joins us now for more reaction to the story. Elton, firstly, what do you make of this case? The Constitutional Court, of course, not really entertaining the merits of this case, saying that it doesn't have any reasonable prospects of success, and putting the ball, fairly and squarely in the hands of the Department of Correctional Services.
No, indeed so, Kathy. Obviously, they've shut the door on all the legal process that can emanate from this medical parole saga that we've been seeing unfolding since September 2021. It's now nearly 2 years down the line. So they closed their door and said, okay, now we're going to give this administrative process that you tasked the court with back to you guys and say, deal with it and adequately deal with it. Because obviously we know that parole is an issue. It's an administrative process that is decided upon by the parole board, the parole appeals board, and obviously when we talk about medical parole, there's also the medical parole unit that comes in and they deal with these issues. So now they're saying, take back your prickly pear, deal with it, and deal with it in accordance with the law.
It seems to me that it's this very issue of medical parole that perhaps the Department of Correctional Services was trying to avoid having to go back to, that it may now have to go and relook, especially given, again, the previous court judgments on this, because the Constitutional Court upholding the ruling of the Supreme Court of Appeal, which is effectively the ruling of the High Court, in and of itself is quite self-explanatory in terms of what they said the Correctional Services Department should do.
No, obviously, indeed so, and I would say that the Supreme Court of Appeal partially agreed with the High Court to say that how the former Correctional Services boss, Arthur Fraser, actually exercised his powers was unlawful, and that exercising of his powers should be looked at. Now, the thing is, like, even if they go and say, okay, now the parole was given unlawfully so, the former president was still placed under parole and there were certain conditions attached to it. So now if we look at the SCA judgment, the SCA judgment is pretty much, it's clearer. It gives us a good idea that the court doesn't want to interfere as to how the department will determine what time spent under medical parole will be taken into consideration. They say that is for the department to determine. So the current commissioner will now have to say, am I going to consider the months that the former president spent on medical parole where he was under house arrest or whatever they say he was under, and the conditions, should it be counted to his sentence? And then obviously once you count that, you'll see, okay, after he spent half of his sentence, which was like more or less 7.5 months of his sentence, then he becomes eligible for normal parole. Would he have then been placed on parole? And those type of things. So it's now going to be a mathematical calculation, because since he was sentenced in June 2021, up until now, 15 months has elapsed. So the time for him serving his period. So for me, this calculation, I don't know how they're going to work with it, but I also think that it might be sort of a win in principle. But I think it might also just come down to that the former president can go into prison today and tomorrow he'll be released because he's eligible then for parole now, given that he served medical parole, and how the department will now calculate what portion of that parole should be considered for him to be released.
Elton, John Steenhuisen is not incorrect when he says that this matter is unprecedented. In many ways, the commissioner here for Correctional Services is also, charting, he's walking on uncharted waters, because I don't remember a case in South Africa where somebody has been granted medical parole, but then has to come back from that medical parole and potentially serve part of the sentence. So looking just at that aspect alone, this case is likely to still have life in the courts again, because, one gets a sense that we're in the territory of charting new legislation here.
No, not necessarily. There was a lot of people that was placed on medical paroles for real reasons. Yeah, it was like the court said, because we had two conflicting reports and he was not seen by certain people, they said, okay, how the commissioner came to override a decision of medical doctors, him not being a medical doctor, was unlawful and irrational, was not procedurally fair. And for me, this happens a lot, that you get certain decisions and it gets challenged. It's just that we don't see it sometimes in the media. But for me, now, going forward, that's sort of how the court said, okay, Commissioner, from now on, you have to pull up your socks and make sure whoever is granted medical parole, that the correct procedures should be followed. And I think DCS has done it in the past where they have granted medical parole, and obviously it was unchallenged. And the classical example is Mr. Shabir Sheikh. He was also granted medical parole and he ended up being on the golf course after being terminally ill. But a case where we had also medical parole, where it was granted is former police commissioner Jacob Zuma, and he actually passed on. So there is these cases, and obviously, as you say, it's uncharted terrain, because now we have like sort of half sharpened our view on how the internal process, this administrative process works, and how it is administered. And we need to look at, is it administered reasonable, fair, and there is no undue influence by people sitting in power positions to actually influence how the decision is made, so that the decision, if it's an ordinary South African like Kathy and Elton that appears before that commissioner or the parole board or the medical parole board, that they would be also given that same treatment as was meted out to a individual of status, if one can put it that way.
So the point that I'm getting to, Elton, is that you described it as the maths that the National Commissioner will now have to do in terms of whether or not there is a portion of an outstanding sentence that the former president would have to serve. And that then being the crux of the issue, I don't foresee a situation where that is not challenged in the courts, regardless of whether it is in or against the former president's favor.
No, indeed so, Katie, but you have to look at it in this light, as that because he was given medical parole, and now we're not going to say is it lawful or lawful, because the court has now said that decision it's unlawful. So now, because even if Katie has been given a sentence, be it right or wrong, and you abide by that conditions and you serve that sentence, because your movement is still limited, because he was sort of half confined to Nkandla, to say you cannot leave the district of Nkandla. So it was a lesser strict than being in escort prison, but he was at his home, he could not move. And so it's now for the commissioner to decide, am I going to take that period of medical parole into consideration, that he was confined to Nkandla and he had to report to the police station or to the authorities of DCS when he wants to leave the jurisdiction. So he needs to make now that decision to say, am I going to count it? If not, and they say, okay, we're not counting anything, then it means that technically he has to go, and that's just my maths, that he has to go to escort prison, sit there for another 5.5 months, and then he becomes eligible for normal parole, given that he meets all the criteria set out under the Correctional Services Act. Then he can then qualify for parole and then do it that way. But it is now within the scope, not necessarily the commissioner, but the parole board, the commissioner, all of them, all these stakeholders have to now talk to each other and say, listen, yeah, this is how this person should be treated according to the law and not according to his status. But it is going to be, for me, it's going to be, the calculations will come in. And it might be that he might not spend a night more in prison if they do the calculations in his favor.
All right, Elton Hart, we'll leave it there for tonight. Thanks for your time.